you can't like have the data or the inputs to make that like a semi-automatic decision, which is what you would want. So that leads me then, I want to just make clear how I answer that question, is to look to history. And again, the history is not ambiguous. We fail far more often than we succeed, and it's not even close.
Have you considered the possibility that I might be built different?
maybe you're built different, or we'll construct the perfect system. Just color me skeptical.
The United States does not do this. This would be insane for us to do. If we were like posturing nuclear weapons now in the modern 21st century in response to what neighboring countries do, they're not even talking about like sovereignty.
Though, wouldn't you say that's the sign of weakness? It's not a sign of strength. The United States doesn't need to do that. Putin needs to do that.
Yeah, but he does have nukes, which it's one of those. It's the sign of weakness from a person with a suicide vest strapped to their chest, you know. But we don't want to invade Ukraine, of course. We're giving them money and weapons, which is a far sight better than what Russia wants to do with them. And I get called, you know, a chauvinist for saying this, but I feel like this is consistent with an anti-imperialist perspective broadly, considering it's what the people of that nation seem to want.
Yeah, the way I would describe it, it's consistent with a liberal internationalism, which is the sense that, you know, the United States has the capability to manufacture the world in a particular way. And that's been the dominant or a dominant approach to American international affairs for a long time. So I'm just going to say...
We're only doing what they want, right?
Right, and then who's they?
Do you both want to give just a quick introduction to yourselves so I can adjust the volume levels? Maybe we'll start with you, Daniel.
Yeah, sure. So my name's Daniel Bessner. I'm an associate professor at the University of Washington. I've also written for venues like Jacobin, N+1, and in the 2020 primary, I was on the Bernie Sanders foreign policy team, sort of the group of advisors that were helping him develop foreign policy.
Sounds good, Vaush.
Well, geez, I didn't do any of that. I'm Vaush, and I have a YouTube channel. So so now I get to talk about this and have my voice listened to by an enormous number of people with no official, education on the subject.
Nice.
Well, that sounds great.
Dream.
So we're going to be having a conversation about U.S. foreign policy. It's going to be relatively unguided. I don't think I'll be having to do too much moderation, as you both are very professional individuals. And basically, I'll just probably serve to steer the conversation in a direction if things tend to get a little loopy. We're going to try and limit it to an hour, hour and a half, at which point we'll do about 30 minutes of audience Q&A. So please, audience, if you're watching this, any of you have any questions, jump into the Serfs.tv chat or the YouTube chat and at me, and then we'll try to keep track of the best ones. And there's no paywall, so don't worry, you don't have to do a super chat to get your question heard in any way, shape, or form. And then I guess with that, why don't we open with Daniel? Why don't you express some of the things you want to discuss?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for setting this up. Really do appreciate it. And I also should have mentioned I'm the co-host of a foreign policy podcast called American Prestige. If anyone wants to check that out, please do, where you find podcasts. So I guess my general proposition is that I think the United States should essentially draw down its empire. What do I mean by its empire? Presently, as probably everyone listening is vaguely aware, at least the United States spends an enormous amount on its military, between $750 and $800 trillion. We have 750 overseas military bases. Essentially, the global reserve currency is the American dollar. And I think that if one looks at the history of the actually existing American empire, which I would date to roughly World War II. Of course, the United States has always been an expansionist power, starting with East Coast settlement, moving west, going further during the War of 1898 to take literal colonies in the Philippines and Puerto Rico. And in fact, today, some people might not know the United States actually has control of 5 populated colonies: Puerto Rico, Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and I'm blanking on the last one, American Samoa. So we are a colonial power in that sense, but even more than that, we have this sort of global presence. And I would say when you look at the history of what the United States has done abroad as a whole, we've actually done more damage to the world than good. I think what the US did in Europe, in Western Europe, was a general good. It basically ended war in Western and Central Europe for much of the post 1945 period. But when you look at the global South, I think what you see is a series of attempted coups, some of which succeeded, most of which, whether they succeeded or not, caused enormous damage. You could point to the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran, the overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz, Allende, participation in the Indonesian genocide in the 1960s. So the U.S. has really done enormous damage, in addition to what people listening might be more familiar with, like the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, the intervention in Libya. So I would say, I think, as an American citizen, someone who has a voice in this country, it's my duty to essentially try to restrain U.S. foreign policy because, on balance, as I said, I think it's done more damage to the world. There are larger claims I could make that are essentially philosophical about the ability of an outside power to really know what's going on in another country, which is based on intelligence, which is based on particular types of access. But I'll let it stand there that on the whole, the U.S. has done more harm than good in the world.
And
Vaush?
I waiting patiently for Lance to step in and give me permission to talk. Now realize, of course, that a casual conversation doesn't need that. So a lot of what you said, I just flatly agree with in terms of U.S. empire and the harm that we've done to the world. The broad strokes of the matter, that is to say that we should begin the process of, obviously we can't just do this, like I can't single-handedly, but it would be nice if we drew down the military budget, if we reduced the number of military bases we had abroad, if we prioritized interdependence with other nations through mutually beneficial trade agreements rather than through neocolonial exploitation, through deposing democratically elected leaders in favor of autocrats who are more amenable to American business interests. There are a great many things that we're doing that we should stop. I guess the things that concern me is that there are fine details that I don't fully understand in terms of how we could affect the least harm or the most good. So, for example, neocolonialism is bad. The IMF and the World Bank are bad. Hopefully not hot takes here, but the fact remains that in spite of how terrible they are, there are also several countries, a good many countries, only lifelines to any reasonable trade bloc currently. Of course, if we keep people in sweatshops, that's terrible, but if the alternative is absolute destitution, this is very much a, should we be thanking the abusive father who takes the orphan and keeps them in the rat-filled basement, as opposed to letting them be out in the street type deal? We're dealing with two different flavors of terrible outcome. And I don't mean to suggest that any outcome here is, at least within the available range of things we can expect might happen, good. None of them are good. When we cede power, Russia and China expand. I don't know if they're necessarily any better than us. In fact, I'm quite disfavorable towards them. When we disassociate ourselves economically from countries which are dependent, it would be nice if they could do some, the four tigers of Southeast Asia, protectionist policy, rise themselves up from nothing type deal. But of course, there are other neocolonial empires that'll scoop up what remains. At this point, in the situation we live in right now, I don't know what practical steps we can take to actually go about reducing American power, engaging in decolonization. And sometimes the conversations that I have with people online lead me to believe other people don't actually care about any of those things. They just don't like American power. Like with this Russia-Ukraine situation, decolonization is when we don't give armaments to Ukraine when they want them, but is when we allow Russia to invade Ukraine, which they very unambiguously do not want. And other stuff like that, The Belt and Road Initiative is maybe a bit better put together than how we typically run our neocolonial projects. I acknowledge that, but it's not as though China, if given the same power and prominence, wouldn't do exactly what we do. sometimes worse, sometimes better on a global stage. And we know Russia has to resort to even worse methods because they don't have the economy to engage in neocolonialism the way we do. They have to invade, which is scary. And it means they have to push themselves up against NATO borders, and that threatens war, real war, potentially globally disastrous war. I'm asking you, because I want answers to these questions. In practical steps, what can we do? What decisions can we make? What positions can we advocate for that aren't just going to leave a power vacuum open to other groups?
I mean, I think those are great questions, and those are basically the right questions. If one considers oneself to be a moral person, these are things that one has to take seriously, particularly if one identifies broadly on the left and sort of the moral politics of that. I think probably a disagreement we have is that I don't view international relations as sort of a sphere in which there are vacuums that are automatically filled. I think this is something that Americans do. We do view it that way, and we actually impute other motivations or really our motivations onto other powers. And the prime example of that, I would say, is George Kennan's long telegram of February 1946. So what is that? So people might have heard of the grand strategy of containment, which is what the United States followed during the Cold War in different forms, but broadly speaking, that was true, which was the idea is that you contain the Soviet Union, especially when it comes to moving past Eastern Europe into Central and Western Europe. This was the US strategy. And this strategy was first articulated in 1946 by a guy named George Kennan. And what Kennan argued essentially was that Marxism-Leninism was an ideology that had global and universalist aspirations, and that it was necessarily expansionist, that no matter what would happen, the Soviet Union viewed itself as having a world historical mission that encompassed the globe. I would say a couple of things there. I would say that when one actually digs into the archives of what was happening in the Soviet Union in the 40s and the 50s, you look at the work of someone like Vladislav Zubak, who's really the guy who did this, is that that's actually not the case. And the Soviet Union pretty early on didn't really have this sort of total expansionist vision of itself. What was happening, I think at least, was that someone like Kennan was actually imputing a universalistic, an American universalism onto the Soviet Union, because I do think this country has baked into its DNA a type of Protestant universalism, this idea of being a city on a hill, the idea that expressed by someone like Woodrow Wilson and to a lesser degree FDR is that global peace and prosperity depends on the world following American ideas. I don't think other powers actually believe that. So take the Belt and Road Initiative. I think that though China did have some intention of winning over the global South, I don't think the initiative approached what the United States has done in terms of development aid, in terms of winning supposedly the hearts and minds of the global South onto its side. I don't think China has genuinely global aspirations. I would say the same for Russia. I would say what both China and Russia do have is regional aspirations. I think they both want to be hegemonic in their region. China wants to be hegemonic in East Asia. Russia wants to be hegemonic in broadly Eastern Europe, however you want to define that. And they don't want the United States to be the regional hegemon there, which it is now. And so we could talk about that, who would suffer under Chinese hegemony or Russian hegemony. And I think, Vaush, you're right. It's not going to be peaches and cream for everyone. But it is, I think, important to start from the base that these are wants and desires that great powers have. Like, for example, as the United States announced in the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, it wanted to control the Western Hemisphere, and it does. Now, that's not something I support. I don't think the United States should be hegemonic throughout the entire Western Hemisphere, but it is, and this is what great powers want. So I'm not sure if naturalness is the right word, but at least if one has strategic empathy, one understands why the modern Russian Federation has memories of German land invasion and French land invasion going back centuries and wants a security buffer. So I just think that's something to understand. Now, the question that I think you asked, which is a good one, is what are the steps one takes, right? I think you have to think in time horizons. And I think history provides a guide. And this is often the question that arises in humanitarian intervention. There's a genocide happening. Shouldn't the United States, which is a superpower, intervene in that genocide to stop innocent people from dying, right? This is an argument. And I think it's an argument that a lot of people who were morally coherent made over the course, particularly of the 90s and 2000s. It's faded a bit from the scene, but I think it allows us to get into this question. So, what I would say is that if one is thinking in a medium term time horizon, the sheer fact of the matter is that if you want to dismantle the empire, you can't really have the capabilities to intervene in that way, to pick winners, to decide who's on the right side of history, who's not on the right side of history. So that's going to result in some short-term harm. I think that's absolutely true, and it's something to really think about and take seriously. But if one believes that ultimately, as leftists, and this is really my argument, you have to focus on the structure of empire, you're going to have to make some very difficult short-term decisions in order to create a type of world that you want to see in the medium and long term. And it'll be a difficult world, and it'll be one that is by no means perfect. But I think that is really how we should be thinking about it. We shouldn't always focus on the type of moment of intervention, which is what we tend to do in the United States for a variety of reasons, a lot having to do with the nature of our media. But we need to focus on these sort of larger structures and these long-term time horizons. So just to wrap up here, it's just my opinion that the United States should really stop intervening, should stop choosing winners abroad, because I would say history has demonstrated that it oftentimes get things wrong. So let me just with this statistic. So, for example, during the Cold War, the U.S. tried to overthrow regimes 67 times, and it succeeded about 25 times. And even when it didn't succeed, it often resulted in quote unquote authoritarian outcomes, bad outcomes. And I would point people to the book titled Covert Regime Change by Lindsay O'Rourke. So I would just say history has demonstrated that those interventions don't really do what they're supposed to do most of the time, and that if we want to create a more just world, we actually have to decrease the empire, lower the budget, get rid of the bases, and just stop intervening in the politics of other areas and regions of the world.
I feel like, so I disagree with almost everything that you've said in some form or another here, so I'm glad we centered on this quickly. In terms of the perceived global ambitions of other geopolitical powers, I understand that regional hegemony is something that Russia and China are more likely to aim for now because they're not capable of global hegemony like we are. But I think that's changing. Russia doesn't have its reach around the globe, not anymore at least. But China isn't just looking at Southeast Asia. They've invested heavily in the development of Africa, which is hardly their geopolitical space. And they also have kept decently close ties with some of the more social democratic leaderships in South America. I imagine because to those groups, siding with China as a broader, global power is preferable to America, given America's history with social democrats in Latin America. Can't blame them, but I don't understand what would deprioritize global domination for these groups. It's just a matter of what you can actually achieve. There are parts of the world that are off limits, of course. Nobody's going to take a nuclear power, for example. That's just essentially off the table. Countries that don't have nuclear armaments, though, still feel like they're open to the kind of colonial or neo-colonial grabs that we've been engaging in for centuries, and other countries now are starting to catch up on. It seems like, if anything, there's this compensation because America currently isn't annexing any territory. It doesn't seem like a thing we have an interest in doing, thank God, but China can, and Russia is. They're making up for lost time, and I don't think they're only interested in their regions. I think they're interested in what they can take, and what they can take will be determined by how much power they have to actually affect. Even with the Soviet Union, you had the Trotskyist global communist revolution approach versus Stalin's more, protectionist communism within the Soviet Union attitude. But the attitude of Stalinist Soviet Union was, to build out a power block, a Soviet power block, and wait for the capitalist world to fall. And one of the reasons why, these goals are inseparable, this global political influence, is because we're all fighting over resources now, right? Eastern Ukraine has natural gas resources that Russia desperately wants to control itself and definitely does not want the West to have just free access to. There are, rare earth minerals in parts of Africa and Latin America that would be crucially beneficial for any domestic production. I don't think there's any reason that a country would only want to control its territory. Like, everyone wants the world. It's just a matter of how good they are at it, right? And in terms of the anti-interventionism, I feel like we're lumping a lot together potentially. Like, there's a very broad range of behaviors that we're consolidating down into um, interventionism. So I agree, for example, because you put coups in there. I'm not going to defend coups or deposing democratically elected leaders or anything like that, unless it's Putin. I have to stand up to my spicy Twitter clips. But in terms of like backing the winner, there isn't just like a losing and a winning side and what's going to happen in Ukraine. There's a right or a wrong side. And in this case, we're not talking about deposing leaders or anything. We're talking about supplying armaments that they want, that the population supports. So I don't, it's not just like an isolated power grab either, because America doesn't stand to like annex the territory afterwards. It's to all of Europe's interest, essentially, that Russian expansionism not allow them to get any closer to the current like NATO line. So if, it seems to me like there are going to be tough decisions we have to make if we want to reduce our role as the world police. But sometimes I feel like our participation isn't just like humanitarian intervention. It's just people of the world sticking up to a potentially bad outcome. And in this case, I think that we're right to try to keep Russia's hands off Ukraine by supplying them arms, or potentially sanctioning Russia as a deterrent or a punishment for engaging in that behavior, because they have to not do that. It would be good if they could stop doing that, ideally.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot there, and I think that's pretty thoughtful. So I think one thing I would say is that the type of analysis, or really your assumptions about geopolitics, are very much shaped by the realist tradition of foreign policy, which really focused on material capabilities and assumes a particular form of human nature, what Hans Morgenthau, who was the guy who developed realism, called, I believe I'm getting this correct, forgive me if I'm wrong, an animus dominandi. Like, it's a human nature to just naturally expand to fill power vacuums. I would just say, personally, and this is something that everyone needs to decide for themselves, I don't think human beings are like that necessarily, and I don't think international politics necessarily functions in that way. So I totally take your point about the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, being done in Africa, but I don't think that signals a Chinese search for world domination by any stretch of the imagination. I think that China, particularly the Communist Party, is primarily worried about its domestic political stability and the future of the party, given the rapid transformation in the Chinese political economy over the last 40 years, and has no real desire to, for example, construct a global basing structure, what people have termed the empire of bases that the United States has constructed, which, as you rightly point out, does not rest on annexation, even though I don't want to ignore the fact that we do have 5 colonies, but does not rest, the U.S. doesn't want to, make Ukraine a state or make Ukraine a territory. I think that's absolutely correct. But it's still a different form of empire, the sort of imperial empire and the economic empire of dollar hegemony. But what I would argue is that when one is engaging in political and geopolitical analysis, one needs to focus less on just the pure capabilities and actually on political intentions. And this is, I'll plug my book. This is something I address a lot in my book titled Democracy in Exile, which is the disagreement between people in the 50s when they were trying to make nuclear strategy as to whether you just focus on capabilities or you focus on intentions and therefore politics. And there were disagreements. And I think the side that one is the side that focused on capabilities because it's easier to quantify capabilities. It's easier to make arguments about capabilities to policymakers to get you to do what you want. But and from my perspective, the most sophisticated political analysis needs to examine history and needs to examine the intentions of actually existing leaders. So I would just disagree as a matter of principle with the idea that because people have capabilities, they will naturally expand. Now, in terms of your historical point about the Soviet, Stalin was just setting up the Soviet power block and waiting for the capitalist world to collapse. I think that's more true of the 40s and up until 1953 when Stalin died than it is of the later Soviet Union. I really do think between 1953 and 1955 was a moment when the Cold War could have ended if the United States had actually focused less on capabilities and more on intentions. So this is partially where my opinion comes from. I think if you were looking at, the people who were fighting to succeed Stalin, what they were arguing, there was a moment there, particularly at the Geneva Conference of, I believe, 1954, when there could have been real détente decades before actual détente happened. So I do think it's important not to only focus on capabilities. And then I think you really get to the heart of the matter in a very strong way about the idea of a right or wrong side. So this obviously begs a lot of questions. Who's determining what's right or wrong? But let's even leave that to the side. The question then I would pose to you is, when historically have we gotten it right, even when we were doing something with noble intentions? I would say the historical record is pretty clear that even when we intervened for so-called humanitarian purposes, let's say the Balkans in the late 1990s, or I would say this was a not insignificant reason why the U.S. invaded Iraq. It often went in a different way than we intended, just because, and this is almost a philosophical point, I don't believe that any one nation has the capability to really shape another a nation in a particular direction, even if one was to say, I know what's right and I know what's wrong. That might be more of a philosophical point. And then the thing I want to end on is you refer to the people of the world. And this is sort of like something that's been going on since the late 19th century, this sort of reference to international public opinion. But I would say that that is not a real opinion that could really be gauged. There's no legitimate institution. There's no way through which the people of the world are able to sort of channel their opinion in that way, in a realistic way. So it's not something that can really be appealed to, even though if someone looks back on sort of the late 90s and early 2000s with the arguments about so-called R2P, responsibility to protect, people would often try to make arguments about like who has sovereignty, where do they have sovereignty, and refer to public opinion. I just don't think those are sort of solid enough things to base geopolitical decisions on. Maybe in a different world they would be, in a more democratic world, in a world without American hegemony, but as it stands in 2022, it's not. So this is why I do think when you take the whole historical accounts into consideration, it really does mitigate against interacting in the politics of other countries. And then I'll just end on this one, sorry. The final philosophical point is, I think the people of a region are more able to determine what they want than the people outside of the region. That for long-term political development, for long-term political stability, that is what should be done. And the nations of Europe are quite rich. They don't need to depend on the United States to continue to fund their defense as they have for decades at this point. And it's a European issue that should ultimately be left to the Europeans. I don't think NATO has a reason for existing any longer, frankly, and we should probably disband it.
I'm just going to interject very quickly for 1 second here and just say that while everything is unbelievably civil and this is a great conversation, it might be difficult, especially for people watching or in format for the two of you having this conversation, if we have like, here's 3 or 4 questions I want to pose you and here's like 3 or 4 answers. Maybe try and focus or concentrate it.
We can go point by point.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll respond broadly, but after that, let's tackle it point by point. I agree. I'll try to respond quickly so we can segue into that. So first of all, you claim that my beliefs on geopolitics and the universality of global domination are rooted in a misconception in human nature, but I disagree. Historically, it seems like all empires expand to the limits of their potential expansion. Historical examples of empires who grow complacent and only tend to their borders are fairly minimal. When they have the military or economic power, they take what they can. There are obvious examples, like what we saw with the entirety of Western colonialism, but it goes well beyond that. If you want to look towards the Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, Japanese city-states and vassalages fighting with each other. It seems like there's always the desire to take more because, as you said, China's doing Belt and Road in Africa largely for domestic stability, but that's why we do it, right? The empire doesn't conquer the world because they care about the world. The empire conquers the world because the resources of the world make the empire richer, because the good PR of suppressing foreign peoples fuels the bloodlust of your citizenry because it's good for getting reelected. It's not really about the world. It's always about you, the people you care about, you know? Rome scarcely cared about people directly outside, the peninsula, the Western Roman Empire had its territories, sure, but they knew who they cared about. And I don't think we're living in any different a situation now. I feel like all empires expand to the limits of their power. And I guess I don't see any reason to believe why that wouldn't be the case. The Soviet Union did this as well. They invaded Afghanistan. They sent tanks into Hungary. They did everything they could to send diplomats to run their coups, to financially and militarily incentivize other countries to fall in line with them. We're all bastards. It's just a matter of whose reign is the most effective and the most stable. We won that game, but I don't think we won it because we were uniquely bad or vicious. I think we won it because we were uniquely rich. That's not a tremendous celebration of our moral supremacy, but it does make me concerned about this, in my opinion, rather naive belief that if we simply retracted, we can trust other geopolitical powers to not take up the space that we left. The only other thing I'll say is that I agree with your final point, which is that we often get these things wrong and we should defer to the will of these countries in terms of their support. And in this case, Ukraine has unambiguously thrown its weight behind the West, wanting to be a part of NATO, requesting support in terms of like armaments and munitions, taking advantage of that which we gave them. If they want our support, I think it's fine. The only reason NATO still exists is because Russia seems intent on maintaining a distinct military and economic bloc. I agree that NATO seems kind of vestigial in the modern world, but you know who cares about NATO in the day-to-day? It's not people who live in the UK. It's people who live in Estonia. It's people who actually live closer to Russia. Because for them, NATO actually means something. It means they're not going to be the next ones to be Ukrained. Nobody in America or like France cares about NATO. They're safe. Nothing will happen to them. They have nuclear weapons. They're far from Russia. But, if the issue here is Russia and the countries next to Russia are afraid of them, then, yeah, it seems like in this case, we do have a right and wrong side. The people who are to be victims of this conflict have chosen.
Yeah, I think I agree that if you're in, the Baltic states, that NATO is important to you because you don't want to have Russian domination, which these states historically had. And if you look at their experience during, literally during World War II, they went back and forth between the Nazis and the Soviets, and it really wasn't a great situation. So I totally empathize with the sort of politics that people want. And I think it's important to sort of empathize with all of those things. I am speaking, though, from a bit, the perspective of an American. I'll just talk really quickly about, Vaush, what you were saying about the reasons for expansion. And I would say that what most IR scholars attribute expansion to, even realists today, if anyone studied poli-sci in college, it's sort of the neo-realist perspective that it's less human nature, which philosophically could kind of explain everything, and more the fact of what's called international anarchy, the fact that there's no overarching body around the globe to prevent expansion and that has a legitimacy that could do things like enforce international law. So I agree that there has been expansion oftentimes, but I wouldn't necessarily attribute it to human nature. And then one could argue that the goal is to get rid of that anarchy or create a democratic and legitimate global structure through which nations are able to appeal. And there's been a lot of problems with that in the past, and we could go into why the League of Nations or the UN failed to live up to what they were supposed to, but I'll leave it at that. But the final thing that I want to say is that I think these are serious issues, and we need to talk in terms of the time horizons that we're really referencing. And then just final, I would point people to the David Graeber and David Wengro book. Have you guys talked about this on the podcast? The Dawn of Everything, which is actually a very interesting new book that actually argues that there's a number of polities that actually did do things like not expand, that did decide not to pursue technological innovation, that did decide things that are in favor of political stability and more equality. Now, I'm not saying this is the final word. It seems like from experts there are problems with this book, but it does open. A space for thinking about maybe this isn't inevitable. Maybe there's not some sort of will to domination that prevents the types of international cooperation that admittedly have been pretty elusive for the past few decades.
Yeah, there certainly there are different complexities here. Some empires, I think, are going to be, for example, I don't think Switzerland is constantly mulling over with their Secretary of Defense or whatever their equivalent is about the potential of invading Germany to get some more Lebensraum. Obviously, there are constraints here. I think that China has well demonstrated its intentions. China, obviously, I think its behavior indicates that it has every intention of being the next world superpower. I don't know if it's going to be able to be that because it's going to face a pretty significant population crash soon with the number of elderly people to be taken care of. And additionally, you can only go so far when a good amount of your domestic labor is like sweatshop producing, cheap plastic toys for Americans. There are thresholds there. They might be able to. I think when I think of peace in the near future, Russia concerns me so specifically because I feel like they aren't component to a lot of the peace incentivizing factors that exist for other countries that we might otherwise have conflict with. America will never go to war with China. It would be ridiculous, of course, because even if we were to somehow win instantly, even if we could somehow snap our fingers and annihilate them with no chance of reprisal, we would devastate our own economy in the process. There would be it's an unwinnable economic conflict. We tend to center our conflicts now in countries with economies that are so war-torn that honestly bombing them only gives them more money because they can resell the scrap from the bombs. Like that's how, like, we're talking about how dirt poor countries like Afghanistan are. We're not blowing up billions of dollars of infrastructure when we engage in our let's say charitably hijinks there. And for that reason, economic development and geopolitical trade or global trade, these are the metrics that seem to incentivize peace. And Russia doesn't seem to want to play ball with that. They had the chance after the fall of the Soviet Union to just be another European country. I'm not saying that that's not implicitly a way of submitting yourself to Western hegemony, because it totally is. But the alternative now is that rather than one hegemonic power in Europe where things are relatively stable, we have one hegemonic power and one power with the nukes of a hegemonic power that's pretending to be hegemonic. Riling up conflict. It's essentially, and they're no better. In many respects, they're worse. The agitation, the conflict, it's brought about by a lack of synchronicity in the region, which is one of the reasons why I'm so hard on Russia here. They can't offer a better world for the countries in their orbit. They're not wealthy enough to do what we do, which is provide a real umbrella of prosperity to countries that we have strong ties to, Western Europe, whatever. So it seems like as long as Russia is the way that it is, it and the countries near it are doomed to destitution and military antagonism towards adjacent NATO countries. And that scares me a lot. I don't know how to fix that without some kind of soft power. People didn't like my take on sanctions, and that's because historically sanctions are shit. I acknowledge that. But I'm at a loss, right? Like, do we simply let Russia take what they want? Do we maintain a hard line? We can take apart NATO, sure, but what about the countries, Estonia, what have you? They don't have nukes. Do they just get to be absorbed? I don't know what the solution is.
Well, I think your last question just points to the fact that there is no good solution. So when I'm thinking as a moral person on the left, I don't want any country to be dominated by any other country, right? That's the ultimate leftist position, which is in some way a liberal position because it's really emphasizing the importance of sovereignty as opposed to other values. But let's just put that aside. I am an American. I like civil liberties and things like that, and I don't like oppression and people conquering other nations. So as a moral person, as a moral actor in the world. That's what I think. But again, as a historian and someone who, might have a voice in American foreign policy, I have to take sort of the whole picture into consideration. And then I, again, just would point people to look at the actual history. Look at Paul Chamberlain's book, Rethinking the Long Peace, which is a history of the Cold War and just shows how violent the Cold War really was, and what horrible consequences U.S. foreign policy actually had on the world. Now, in terms of Russia, I think we are in an interesting situation because Russia is, on paper, a pretty weak country. It has a GDP, I think, actually less than Italy or equivalent to Italy, whatever that famous statistic is, but it does have nuclear weapons. So that does give it sort of a more of a say in international politics. But again, I would have to say, looking on balance, I don't think the U.S. should necessarily decide what happens in Eastern Europe, even if there are outcomes that, as a moral person, I would not prefer. Now, the question of world domination is really important because let's put to the side the intentions of the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping, which, again, I want to reiterate, I don't think have suggested that there is a Chinese will to world domination. I don't think that's accurate, but I'm not a China specialist. I don't speak Mandarin, so I'm relying on other
Can I
people.
ask something really quick? Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. I just want to
No,
clarify.
it's okay. It's okay.
When you say world domination, I want to know what you mean there, because I don't think when I think of American world domination, I think of a world where there is no border an American corporation cannot cross and no worker that cannot be underpaid. When I think of Chinese domination, I think of the same thing, not like literally like the Nazi arrows over the map.
No, totally. So I mean, to me, the sine qua non is the military bases. This is something that we don't often, think about, but there are 750 military bases placed strategically around the globe. And even if they're not like used every day, they are, in my opinion, a constant threat to the entire world. And I would point people to the work, I want to get his name right, David Vine of the Quincy Institute, who just improving U.S. global security through military bases, that I think is really interesting. And he wrote a report, 9 ways that drawing down overseas bases will improve U.S. security. So I'm talking about the military bases. I'm talking about, the imposition, not the imposition, but like a Chinese currency replacing the dollar. So I define American empire as dollar hegemony and the military base structure. That's what it ultimately rests on. So I don't think China is interested in that. China might be interested in sorts of free exchanges of goods. I have no doubt that is on some level somewhat true. But I'm just referring to the structure of the American empire. And then I'll just end on this. I just don't think that's possible anymore, because I want to just read a very quick thing from the moment that the U.S. became hegemonic in 1945, or not even read, I'll just say. So what did that mean? In 1945, when the U.S. became the global hegemon, it had more manufacturing output than the entire rest of the world put together. It didn't require any post-war reconstruction. It totally dominated the Western Hemisphere. It had domination in every sphere of the military, Army, Navy, Air Force, intelligence. It was, and so take the Soviet Union. It was much more powerful than the Red Fleet and the Red Air Force. It didn't have the numbers of the Red Army, but it did have the nukes. It had supplanted the British as the sort of hegemon in East Asia. It was the entire creditor of the international economic system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I would also say, again, bracketing what China actually wants to do in the world, I don't think it's structurally possible for them to dominate the world like the United States did, and because it was kind of grandfathered in, currently does.
Yeah, so I acknowledge that it's bad that we have so many military bases abroad, but I feel like, if anything, those military bases are a vestigial element of the more sinister way in which we affect global conquest these days, which was, as you said, the hegemony of the dollar. We keep our US bases there, usually not as staging points for invasion, which, if we did, of course, we would be in like 50,000 wars right now, as opposed to however many pseudo wars we're currently a part of, but rather so that these countries are marked as our territory. They're our bitches, essentially. We brand them with our military bases. But you can do that without the military base, right? The military base itself is more of a symbolic expression of hegemonic power. The real issue is the economic investment. It's like the difference between controlling a neighborhood by posting a bodyguard in everyone's house, as opposed to controlling a neighborhood by getting them all hooked on drugs, and they have to come to you to get their next fix. It feels like it's a much more efficient way of essentially meting out the same degree of control with way less overhead. If anything, one of the reasons I want America to take down its military bases is so that we have more money to spend on effectively opposing the geopolitical interests of other countries that would do as bad as, if not worse than us, because we seem to bleed quite a lot of money through this vestigial expression of our global power. The Belt and Road Initiative, I think, will achieve ultimately the same goal. And if we're to look at who's being harmed here, the U.S. military bases don't generally harm people. I think people just like jerk off on the base all day, like they sit there. They're like an expression of our power, you know. But yeah, but the poverty we bring to these countries, the poverty we incentivize and maintain through, you know, one-sided trade deals, those kill millions of people every year. The economic dependency is the real harm, and I don't see any metric by which China is intending to do less of this than we are. You know.
Yeah, so I think that's interesting, and I totally agree on the economic damage done by the American empire, and that it's a super important part of the equation. But I do think we on the left tend to sort of de-emphasize just the importance of those bases because they haven't necessarily been used in a major war. So just to take an example, just to take some quick statistics, between 2018 and 2020, the U.S. undertook 85 in at least 85 countries counterterrorism operations, oftentimes linked to bases that are staging grounds, areas for recruitment, areas for exchange, and things like that. So there is a lot of damage being done. And I think if you look at the historical research of the aforementioned Lindsay O'Rourke and the covert regime change, even those sorts of minor special forces interactions actually do have very negative consequences. You know, they do result in more authoritarianism, more violence in particular, even if it's unsuccessful. So I do think it's really important. I appreciate what you're saying about like getting everyone hooked versus putting a bodyguard in everyone's house, but those bodyguards in everyone's house are always reminders that that bodyguard could beat you up. You know, that's not completely meaningless. So I don't want to lose sight of that. And I think if one is thinking a bit theoretically, one of the, you know, interesting moves that can be done in the next few years is for an analyst to unite the economic and security elements of American hegemony. If I recall correctly, if you remember Leo Panich's and Sam Ginden's book, The Making of Global Capitalism, relatively early on, they're like, we're going to talk about the economy and we're not going to talk about the security elements. But I think these things go together and you can't really just bracket one from the other.
I agree with that. They are definitely intertwined, which is, of course, the reason why China recently built a military base in Africa near Djibouti, in a strategic zone that would allow them to better oversee their economic interests in the region. Obviously, they aren't quite competing with our plurality of bases. I'm not saying they're not something worth deconstructing. I only fear the consequences of our disinvolvement. You know, we see a parallel of the Ukraine situation in Taiwan right now, for example, where we've supplied them armaments, you know, defensively in case they're attacked by China. Critics of this action say that, you know, defensive armaments could easily turn to offensive armaments, to which the correct response is, of course, Taiwan isn't going to invade China, you lunatic. That's not going to happen. There's no context in which that would ever happen. Yeah, they're not going to kamikaze the mainland. But you know, people talk about like, well, you disinvolve yourselves. I think that, and this is genuinely tragic, and I come across, of course, as something of a chauvinist by saying this, but a lot of countries understand that in the war for geopolitical control, they only get to choose their master. Taiwan will never be an autonomous master of its own fate. The Baltic region will never, at least not for a very long time, be an autonomous master of their own fate. The only thing that gets you even close to that is nuclear armaments. And even then, you know, trade deals are still an effective way of supplanting the will of other nations. It's about who you choose to rule over you. And the West just offers a better package deal, at least in the Baltic region, than Russia ever could. We're just wealthier, you know? And this isn't so much a supporting U.S. hegemony type issue as it is an acknowledgement that when there's only hegemony to be found, you go with the one that hurts people the least. China is a bit more contentious because, as I understand it, their investments in the Belt and Road Initiative, while similar to what we've done in a neocolonial sense in many ways, sometimes seem to be a little bit better. I understand they're indebting these countries and heavily, infiltrating their economic infrastructure with Chinese businesses, Chinese contracts, Chinese officials. So, and they're going to be indebted, and they're in the pocket for a long run down the line. Possibly they're doing this in a slightly more humanitarian way than we are, in which case I guess my utilitarian approach here would have to be flipped, and I'd have to say that we should supplant them with Chinese hegemony because that's less harmful. So the only reason I bring this up, I feel like we agree on the broad strokes, but when these pivotal issues come up, like with Ukraine, we know at least with Ukraine, they don't have the choice of no hegemon. That's just not an option for them, not with them being at the border of Russia. In those instances, I feel like an unwillingness to involve ourselves in ways aligned with the desires of the Ukrainian people often has the consequence of suggesting by implication that the hegemonic rule of other powers is preferable to our own, or that it's neutral, or there's no difference, that it's just kind of a, well, whose hands are bloody type situation. But we don't want to invade Ukraine, of course. We're giving them money and weapons, which is a far sight better than what Russia wants to do with them. And I get called, a chauvinist for saying this, but I feel like this is consistent with an anti-imperialist perspective broadly, considering it's what the people of that nation seem to want.
Yeah, the way I would describe it, it's consistent with a liberal internationalism, which is the sense that, the United States has the capability to manufacture the world in a particular way. And that's been the dominant or a dominant approach to American international affairs for a long time. So I'm just going to
We're
say
only
it,
doing what they want, right?
right, and then who's they, right? And then
The
at this
Ukrainian people.
so just one second. So I think that we then have to ask, like, offers a better package deal to whom? Because again, I'm not expert on the Ukraine situation, but I imagine that there's different groups in Ukraine that want different things depending on geography, depending on perceived cultural ties, etc. But that's almost neither here nor there, because then we get into questions of sovereignty and who are we talking to, and why do they get to represent the will of the people and other people don't get to represent the will of the people, etc., etc. So I'm going to just stay out of that for a second, because again, I think the question is, are we even able to do this in a good way? And to that, history is the only guide, and history is pretty clear that we're not able to. But if you want, we could get into questions about, like, who is sovereign in a particular moment? Why are they sovereign? Why are they the ones that we should be listening to? Which is ultimately what happens when you zero in on any of these situations, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's the Balkans, whether it's Iraq, whether it's Afghanistan. Who speaks for whom is ultimately the question.
Yeah,
And
of
I
course. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
and I would suggest that in the past we've gotten that wrong more than we've gotten that right. But again, that's a little bit neither here nor there. This is why I think this being clear about the time horizon and the trade-offs that one has to make is really crucial. Because if we're thinking that we do want to get rid of the empire, like you said, get rid of the bases, the budget, spend more on home, whatever you want to do it for, that you do have to at one point make the decision not to intervene, make the choice that the United States doesn't have to have an opinion on what happens everywhere in the world at all moments, while fully admitting to yourself that that will have negative consequences in the short term. And I would say, to do it responsibly, you don't just leave tomorrow. You do things like, let's say in East Asia, have some sort of decade-long security transition where you allow U.S. partners or U.S. allies to begin to build the independent capabilities that would allow them to, in some sort of meaningfully democratic way, make their own way in the world, while admitting that the United States isn't going to be there. Because what I would say is that the United States isn't going to be there. What I fear what will actually happen is that there'll be some drastic move taken by China or Russia the United States has not actually prepared for, but the United States is not going to fight World War III over Ukraine or Taiwan. And so there'll be some slapdash retreat from the region that actually leads people worse off. Because I don't think the United States is going to fight wars over these regions, regardless of whether I think they should or not. And that is also an important political reality that should undergird what we think should be done in these areas.
Yeah, all right. I agree with some of the stuff you're saying, but I feel like some of the language here trends close to apologism for me. So, the American imperialism has found many forms in the past, but I feel that what's happening in Ukraine right now is categorically distinct, where you have a supermajority of the population who want to be a part of NATO, which is a pretty severe step, but broadly prefer American or Western intervention in supplying them armaments to what Russia's doing. I understand that taking a step away from being the world police is a viable long-term step, but this isn't some issue in a vacuum. If Russia takes Ukraine, after all, not only does that cause immense immediate suffering, but they now push their border closer to NATO. If they take all of Ukraine, not just the east of Ukraine, then we come against the same problem over again. And you start having, Russian posturing against the next country that isn't in NATO if we pull back, or if we don't, we then have the Cold War border set up again, except we've drawn the Iron Curtain a little bit farther to the east, which seems to me like a disfavorable geopolitical situation and one that could lead potentially to a lot of harm. I wonder here, because you said that you wanted to defer to the interests of the people there, but the interests of the people in Ukraine are clear. And then you say, well, whose interests? Who's made that decision? I'm not suggesting Ukraine is a perfect democracy. They don't. And I don't think you're ever going to get 100% of any population to agree on anything. But I think it's a pretty well established that the people of Ukraine do not want Russia to invade, and they do want help to prevent that from happening. If we're not to respond to that, not just us as the United States, but NATO and the rest of Europe in alignment with their interest to keep Russia from creeping ever westward, is this not a legitimate act of our power? We're doing what they ask. They request help, and we provide it for them. And all of this is being done in spite of the fact that over the past 10 years, Russia has been funding secessionist groups and political contrarianism in the eastern section of Ukraine. I mean, there's been a whole lot of fighting over there because Russia is explicitly trying to manufacture a political crisis they can take advantage of, which it seems like it hasn't worked yet. Because it hasn't reached the capital. It hasn't done enough to weaken the country to the point that America wants to keep their hands off, that NATO wants to keep their hands off. They're going to keep doing this, Even with NATO countries, it's not a violation explicitly of NATO boundaries for Russia to slip money to secessionist groups in Estonia or what have you, and, they get their rustling, and then 20 years down the line, after being bombarded with Russian-friendly media that sensationalizes domestic issues, makes things seem worse. What they did with us, but, well, worse. They could creep ever onwards again. This isn't just about Ukraine. It's about Russia here. And it's not just about being a world police officer. It's about world peace. It seems like supplying armaments is a good immediate stopgap. If nothing else, a Russian invasion of Ukraine should be mutually bloody rather than bloody only for the Ukrainians.
Yeah, well, I guess just I don't think Putin's going to invade also. So that's just like my reading of this. So let me just state that outright. I may very well be wrong. It's happened in the past. And let's also bracket that the US does a lot of stuff like what you were saying Russia does, and everyone knows that. We all know that at this point. I think in some sense we're talking in different registers. When I said that we should listen to the people, that was more a philosophical claim about people in broad regions are better able to determine how their region should situate itself. I think on the whole, I would say history kind of demonstrates that. And you're making more the philosophical point about legitimacy, and then I would say, whose legitimacy? Is there really an international community that is genuinely democratic, or are these particular elites in various countries? Blah, 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 blah. So I just wanted to note that in some sense.
What do you mean by that, though?
In terms of what?
So,
there's no legitimate body of international law. U.S. doesn't join the ICC. The U.S. doesn't follow its own international laws. The United Nations is not a democratically legitimate institution. Not the entire world has a say in what NATO does. It's oftentimes military elites. These aren't democratic institutions. So then the question becomes, who's deciding what? Is this legitimate or not? And those are all, yeah, those are all legitimate questions, but that sort of takes us into the nuts and bolts, and I don't think we're really.
But we're not talking about UN interventionism, right? NATO is pretty straightforward with what they want, right? NATO wants expansionism, military, defensive pacts. It's not much of a neutral arbiter there. NATO has its clear on-the-shoulder biases. And when it comes to Ukraine, it's not a perfect government, but in this case, it seems like there's a pretty clear synchronicity between what they want: protection from Russia. Now, making Ukraine part of NATO would be inflammatory. Maybe not the best move, but supplying them arms, if nothing else, it's a deterrent. If you think that Russia won't invade, I think that's brilliant. I hope they don't invade. It'd make them look terrible after all that posturing. And now Ukraine is very securely in the bloc of the West, showing that after, since 2014, the Crimea situation, all their fussing about in East Ukraine hasn't managed to budge the country away from its biases towards Western hegemony.
Yeah, I mean, I read Putin as a pretty rational actor who has a particular reading of Russian history that essentially wants a security border, which is the long-term, 250 years old dream of Russian leaders. So I don't think he's like that difficult to read. And I think like if you look at the intervention in Georgia, if you look at Crimea, if you look at what's going on now, he's pretty clear he doesn't want the Western expansion east. And I think that's, you know,
I think
just
he
the
hoped we'd back off of Ukraine. I think he hoped that we wouldn't supply them arms. That after pulling out of Afghanistan, the American people would be so sick of the idea of interventionism that it would be supremely unpopular. Because Biden's approval rating plummeted after Afghanistan, right? Logically, it seems like this would be a great time to take advantage of a lack of taste for interventionism. But thankfully, Comrade Biden stepped up to the plate with arms deals. Lockheed Martin, the vanguard of the proletariat.
right, right.
So maybe he overstepped a little bit. Maybe this was a miscalculation on
I
his
think
part.
he did. And if you look at the demands that he gave, they were wild. They were just you couldn't say yes to those. So I do think he and then we get into like I think Putin's coming to the end of his political career. I think he's worried about the group of oligarchs that he heads. I think he's concerned because Putin has actually been dovish isn't the right word, but he's been less interventionist than a lot of those under him. So I think he finds himself between a bit of a rock and a hard place. And I'm not excusing Putin. I don't, again, in a moral world, this is not the thing that I would do, but I'm trying to think through strategic empathy and putting myself in that particular position from that particular viewpoint, given his own particular history, even if as a moral person, I don't agree with any of it. So that's my read of Putin, may be wrong. I also just want to highlight again the point that you made about like if Putin gets Ukraine, then he's just going to keep on going west and west and west, which is the Munich analogy, right? We failed to stop Hitler in the Sudetenland, therefore we need to stand tough at all moments. I don't think for a variety of reasons that analogy holds. There's been a lot of, writing on the misuse of that analogy, but again, I would encourage people to distinguish between capabilities, which are easily measurable, and that's why people like making arguments based on them, and intentions, which are much more difficult to suss out, but in my opinion, more important, that involve the analysis of history, culture, society, and individual personality and
If
psychology.
But if he didn't want to do that, why has Russian intelligence been so adamant in destabilizing former Soviet satellite states? Not just trying to form economic codependence, which has been difficult because Russia's poor and we're not, but also, like time after time, it's, propagandistic. This fell through. This plan was unmasked. It seems like, and this is, I think, borderline explicit. They want to rebuild the lines that were held during, the Warsaw Pact. They want to reestablish that boundary. I guess I don't really see a future in which Europe is safe without Russia being kowtowed to Western hegemony, because the alternative is them being kowtowed to Russian hegemony, which it seems like the same but poorer, and they do invasions sloppier than we do, because they don't have the money to back their threats up the way that we can. Like they could just be a European country, it's difficult to talk about this in this respect. I feel like a lot of leftists tie Russia to like the legacy of communism or whatever, but Russia in its current form and in its Soviet form are to me as close to Russia as to communism as like the McDonald's Corporation. I have no ideological tie here. They're just different power blocks, and the existence of two in this region is causing a lot of problems. Um, I don't know if sanctioning would do anything helpful. Maybe sanctioning their leaders, freezing assets for wealthy oligarchs in our country, but something has to be done to turn them away from this expansionist tendency, their unwillingness to just live as a neighbor.
So I just want to address myself to that last point because I think it's important. So my read, it depends, I think, how you read the 1990s. And I think the shock therapy of Western capitalism, and this is like not a particularly leftist claim. The leftists do claim this, but this is like what George Soros argues. But I think that the brutality of neoliberal capitalization in the 1990s, basically, and the kleptocracy that it eventually led to, essentially made many Russian elites very skeptical of, quote unquote, just becoming another Western nation. And I think if you look back on the long history of Russia, going back to Peter the Great, you see the pendulum swing between, is Russia, quote unquote, Europe, or is Russia, quote unquote, Asian? And this is something that goes back and forth throughout Russian history with different people answering differently at different times. I would say Russia, there's no way, and I don't think anyone in Russia thinks that they're going to be able to reestablish the borders of the Warsaw Pact, barring threatening nuclear weapons. And I do think then the nuclear powers of Western Europe would respond to that pretty strongly. So I don't think that's really possible right now. So I guess that's not really a fear that I have. And so I think what would be the ideal position is for the United States to actually have genuine outreach with its European partners to Russia and not make clear as they did I think as the Cold War wound down that it wasn't expanding, it won't expand NATO further eastward. I mean, that seems to be the claim. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but it seems to me pretty undeniable that as the Soviet Union was collapsing, Western leaders made clear that NATO wouldn't expand eastward, and they just went back on that. So it's not like crazy or totally unreasonable for someone like Putin to be a little nervous given Russian history about Western expansion eastward. Again, just trying to have strategic empathy and view what he might be thinking. So I guess I don't see these catastrophic circumstances as being in the realm of reality, sort of like these the engendering of a new European war or a new Berlin Wall or a World War III. That doesn't seem to me to be really on the table, given the realities of Russian power and the realities of Russian intentions as I understand them.
We never promised we wouldn't move eastward, I don't think. We had an on the table agreement to avoid NATO expansion during a time period when the Soviet Union or its remnants were pulling out of East Germany, but outside of that, it was a sort of one of the points which was brought up to Gorbachev, which was never formalized. I mean, obviously, with regards to this expansionism, it's something that is going to continue to the greatest possible extent, no matter what promises are made or kept. Russia did, of course, make a promise explicitly to respect Ukrainian territorial sovereignty in return for Ukraine giving their nukes back to Russia, and they're fucking around with that at the moment. So, in terms of these agreements, the thing that the reason why I think this paranoia is justified is because Russia is the aggressor and they threaten nukes over this stuff. They've made allusions to nuclear armaments being used or moved in response to Ukraine becoming a part of NATO or during the Crimean crisis as well. Like, the United States does not do this. This would be insane for us to do. If we were like posturing nuclear weapons now in the modern 21st century in response to what neighboring countries do. They're not even talking about like
Sign of
sovereignty.
weakness, though. Wouldn't you say that's the sign of weakness? It's not a sign of strength. The United States doesn't need to do that. Putin needs to do that.
Yeah, but he does have nukes, which it's one of those. It's the sign of weakness from a person with a suicide vest strapped to their chest. They can be as weak as they like as long as they can hold the detonator.
Let me get into the question of intentions, but very briefly, I would point people to the work of Joshua Shifrinson, who really is the guy who went super deep on this, and he makes pretty clear that the U.S. actually did promise not to expand eastward.
I haven't read that particular work. The readings that I've seen haven't led to that. I suppose I'll be forthcoming. I guess my ultimate belief is that I don't really care. Because at the end of the day, the countries that are part of NATO want to be a part of NATO. If we're respecting territorial sovereignty here, these Balkan states, they don't want to just live next to Russia without some kind of defensive pact protecting them. There's a reason they run to us instead of to Russia. It's not just economic security. They remember what Russia was like during the era of the Soviet Union. I cannot blame them for being touchy about these subjects now. And likewise with Ukraine, the issue is like NATO expansion doesn't threaten Russia directly, NATO will never invade Russia. Russia is a nuclear power. It is unfathomable. It can never happen. The only thing NATO meaningfully does is prevent Russia from fucking with their neighbors, which in my mind is something that they shouldn't be doing anyway. It seems like, regardless of promises made, kept, lost, broken, NATO can never really be the aggressor here because NATO has no meaningful capability to engage in violence against Russia, whereas the reverse is true. Russia does have a meaningful ability to engage in violence against countries that aren't a part of NATO. Um, you know what I mean? So
Yeah,
in
yeah, yeah,
terms of the
totally.
expand, it's difficult to navigate, and for Russia to posture with the nukes, they brought it up during the Crimean thing. They brought it up here. They've brought it up multiple times since the end of the Cold War, and it's always because they're mad they can't bully a neighbor. Like Jesus, they need to fall in line, and not even Western hegemony. They need to fall in line to not making nuclear threats when they can't invade their neighbor. I feel like that's a reasonable line to fall to. It's a line America makes. We don't threaten to nuke Mexico when they do something we don't like. If for all of Trump's blustering, he never threatened to invade or nuke Mexico because they kept sending cartels of illegals up towards us, which legitimately feels like a very Putin-esque thing that he would try to employ as a way of stirring up national sentiment if he was in comparable circumstances over there.
Well, I guess I think I view Russia as more of a quote unquote normal nation than you might. I do think if there was the equivalent of NATO in Latin America and it started, in South America and was slowly making its way to Central and North America, it wouldn't be out of bounds, I think, for an American leader to threaten some sort of, quote unquote tactical nuclear exchange. And I think ultimately, I guess what I think that gets to the heart of it. I view Putin and Russia as quote unquote normal. I don't view them as quote unquote revisionist. I don't think that they're going to start World War III. I think it's a declining power, a superpower that's not a middle power. And for a lot of domestic political reasons, Putin wants to shore up his authority and shore up Russian prestige for various reasons in ways that I disagree with. But to me, it's very readable. It's not that difficult to understand what's going on. And that's why I don't think
It's
that.
understandable. They want territory, right? They want power. They want the
Yeah, they want a sphere of
defensive wall.
influence,
Yeah.
however you define that, right? And in a world where they basically had a huge one that is shrinking ever more. Um,
It would
but yeah,
be like it would be like the United States getting angry that people in Puerto Rico were talking about secession, so we like sent a military fleet over there and threatened to nuke anyone who like if the United States
might have
did
done
that.
that in a different era of history. We wouldn't do it in 2022,
Well,
but
yeah, well, yes, that's critical because now we have nukes. There's a very important difference here. We couldn't end the world over a skirmish before, but now we can. If America ever did that, the world would unify in condemnation. Like everyone, I guess, except for American neocons, whatever they're up to, I'm sure they'd love it. But like everyone would criticize this. But like, oh, Russia threatening nukes because they're mad that they can't do more invasions of their neighbors. Like, like I guess that's normal in the sense that I expect countries to act in their geopolitical interests, and the former Soviet bloc has left kind of a vacuum of poverty that they can exploit. But like, if that's normal, like that's a bad kind of normal,
it's
right?
not
Like,
good. It's not
yeah,
something that I support. But I don't think that I guess just to put a fine point on it, I don't think that indicates some sort of invasion or war or actual use of nuclear weapons. And I would point to the 58 to 61 Berlin crisis about Soviet atomic blackmail, which this is actually a long-standing tactic in the Soviet toolbox because they are so much weaker than the United States. They've been doing this since the Cold War. Let me a guy I
it's
wrote my first
bad.
book about.
They're
No,
backed up against the wall. They're dangerous. They're like a
don't think
wounded
it's
animal.
I would look at this book called, or a publication called Soviet Atomic Blackmail in the North Atlantic Alliance from 1957, which basically says everything you need to know about this
Chido
subject.
gave
And the
What
author
tier 1
concludes, if I recall
subscription.
correctly, that it doesn't actually indicate necessarily a desire for nuclear war, but it's a sign of weakness and a sign of like trying to exaggerate a threat in order to get what you want, which is what, not something I would like to do in the world, but this is how international relations functions. So I
How do
don't
we
think that's
stop it?
necessarily indicative. How do we stop? Like the big
Because
question is, how
we
do we
can't
stop?
we can't the nuclear threats have to stop. Like that's like the ultimate bad, right? Like
This is the big
everything else.
that is the huge question, right? Like, so the question is some sort of engaged disarmament, a unilateral disarmament, and no first use policy. The reality is, good or bad, no nation's giving up their nukes. right? So absent the world proletariat revolution, I don't see a step-by-step path to getting rid of nuclear weapons. It really is Prometheus's box, you know.
But we don't have to get rid of nukes, right? We just have to get rid of Russia. Because the UK, Germany, France, Spain, they have nukes. This isn't an issue. They don't threaten world peace. We can't get rid of nukes, and Russia will never get rid of their nukes because they know that's the only reason that they haven't been invaded. If Russia didn't have nukes, we would have intervened in there a long time ago. So, absent that potential solution, something has to be done to readjust their geopolitical interests to the point that they no longer feel the need to posture and threaten the way that they do. That's the only way out that I see. Invasion can't be done for so many reasons, and they will never agree to get rid of their nuclear weapons because they know they'd then be invaded. So where do we it feels like we have to I don't know, like I don't think sanctioning can do this. Find a way to like break up their block economically, you know, like
I don't
cut
think
them
there's
off.
I don't think there's an immediate solution. I mean, I think that's the truth. I think there'd have to be developments in world politics before that becomes a feasible reality at this
Uh,
point. I don't think there's
Man,
a step-by-step way to do that. I can't see it, at least. That's why I was joking about the world proletariat revolution, right? You need some gigantic exogenous shock.
joking. It's serious to me.
So when that happens, then we'll figure it out. But I don't think there's an immediate way to do that. I think what can be done, people who are I actually don't know where you guys are, as someone who's an American citizen who speaks with a voice in American politics, is to basically reduce American influence on the world. And that's what I keep on coming back to, that it's better for people in their own environment, in their own region, to determine what should be done without the United States making decisions for them. Again, not tomorrow, but some sort of legitimate security transition, which makes people in the region have their stakes in their own politics, while also recognizing the United States isn't going to be able to get what it or what a moral person who finds themselves in the United States wants done in the world. One, because morality isn't necessarily universal and people have different beliefs. And two, because I just think historically we don't have the ability to shape politics in that way. It always fails.
Yeah, well, I agree that, you know, there's a degree of subjectivity when it comes to morality. I just don't care what other people think. It's my way, I guess, and my great big $800 billion American military war machine. In terms of like what we can actually do, though, you're right. Intervention doesn't really work usually because it's not like a really bad guy that's doing the thing. It's usually some fucked up incentive structures, and you can't destroy those with bombs. You can destroy people and buildings with bombs. But if there's an incentive for really bad outcomes, I don't think that American military intervention can fix that. Sometimes, I mean, you know, if it really is like it's the bad government, you know, World War II, Germany, Japan, whatever, okay, sure, fine. But for the most part, I don't think that sort of stuff works. I support what we're doing in Taiwan and Ukraine, not because I think America should have a say over Taiwan and Ukraine, but because the people in Taiwan and Ukraine seem to prefer America's hegemonic blanket over China and Russia's respectively. So in deference to their will there, and to a, however liberal, belief in, you know, national sovereignty, I think that they have some right to ask and we have some right to answer. In other cases, though, I mean, we see how this stuff goes. We know what we did in Libya, you know, we know how Syria is looking right now. Afghanistan's doing great, as we all know. 20 years of building democracy. If only we'd spent 40, you know, maybe everything would have worked. Um, as a broad project, I agree. But I do feel that a conflation of different types of interventionism can sometimes lead to us not opposing interventionism, but rather implicitly supporting Russian or Chinese interventionism, which has far worse outcomes in these specific cases, by way of our abstemiousness. Yes, our abstemiousness, our unwillingness to get our hands dirty.
Abstemiousness, I think.
Abstemiousness. Thank you. Thank you.
But just one point, because I think that's really crucial. If you have the capabilities to participate in a quote unquote good intervention, you have the capabilities to participate in a bad one. And I think the goal, for me at least, is to make sure we don't have those capabilities at all.
That is true. If you have the ability to and have set the precedent for intervention in other situations, you're kind of leaning back and hoping that the powers that be will only implement that power and implement that rationale when it's good to do so.
to
Yeah.
I
know,
acknowledge that. I
yeah.
don't think there's a way around that, unfortunately. I guess I would have to hope then that in the cosmic dice that we and other countries roll, we have a better chance of being successful in our behavior than Russia and China would be in their respective situations, assuming that there's a vacuum to be taken advantage of, or a conflict over prosperity in the region. There are probably ways by which you could do that, like for example, systems of approach. Are you doing this with the overwhelming majority of the people's support, or are you doing this because you agree with some militia group and you disagree with the government? Like what power base are you building upon? Is the problem you're addressing something that can actually be fixed for the people in that country with military force or with armaments, or is it just something bad is happening and having soldiers there feels like the right thing to do? There are probably ways to streamline that you could eventually arrive at a process where you're more likely to get a good intervention than a bad intervention. But
That's been
ult-
tried.
it,
I mean,
yeah, and America's not going to do it either, because you have to build those processes first. And what I think is moral isn't what the U.S. thinks is geopolitically, prescient. So there's going to be, yeah,
right,
uh,
right. So just to point out, historically, there was this big thing called systems analysis in the 50s and the 60s that tried to do that, and I think it's literally ontologically and epistemologically impossible. You can't like have the data or the inputs to make that like a semi-automatic decision, which is what you would want. So that leads me then, I want to just make clear how I answer that question, is to look to history. And again, the history is not ambiguous. We fail far more often than we succeed, and it's not even close.
have you considered the possibility that I might be built different?
Maybe you're built different, or we'll construct the perfect system. Just color me skeptical.
No, I understand. At the end of the day, we don't have any direct control over what the United States does militarily anyway. I feel it right to support our involvement in Ukraine. If for no other reason, we don't have boots in the ground in Ukraine, so this isn't even like comparable to the kind of intervention we generally talk about. Likewise with Taiwan, we would never risk directly exchanging fire with Russian or Chinese soldiers, because that could be really bad. Really, really bad. In terms of more like engaged conflicts where we've actually put boots on the ground, I do think of I could, a very small number of justifiable examples in which our involvement was actually good. Obviously, the easiest one to go back to would be World War II, because nobody likes the Nazis and so on and so on. And even then, we fucked up because we didn't have to drop the bombs on Japan, and that killed a whole bunch of people. Even that was an arduous path. Yes, Bosnia. Some people talk about different elements here.
That's a tough,
Right, yeah. There are edge. Yeah. This is very, very, very blurry instances. Though I will ask though, and I understand this is a question delivered with the simplicity of a child's mind, but I want to know, what metric, if any, would you use to pull apart from your anti-interventionist perspective and say, all right, it's 1940, whatever. We're going to war. Get in your boats, boys. All right, we're crossing the Atlantic. Okay, Adolf's getting an ass whooping. Would you? And of course, this is like a very morally loaded question. Like, would you let Hitler live? It's stupid, and the war would have ended without our involvement either way. But conceptually, they didn't know that at the time. We didn't know they weren't going to develop their own atomic weapons in time. We got involved. How would you look at that and say, like, this is worth our involvement? What is the line? When do you think it's okay to get in there?
Yeah, well, as a Jew, I'm glad Hitler didn't succeed. But I would say,
Agreed. Look at that.
I wish you could have the intervention in World War II without the the coterminous construction of the American Empire, which is what actually happened in history. So I wish that World War II was used as a moment to build a more democratic global structure than what actually happened, which was to create a structure organized around American armed primacy. That's just simply how I'd phrase it. I find that intervention necessary. But I don't find the construction of the empire, which occurred during World War II and then really took off afterward and was embodied in the international institutions like the UN, the GATT, etc., of American hegemony, to have been necessary to the intervention.
Okay, I agree with that. Though that doesn't actually tell me what line would have been crossed to justify, right? Because if we're talking death camps here, like in Rojava, things got pretty spicy, with a lot of people dying all over the place. Like, where do we, is it like the threat of global domination? Is it allies being invaded? Because, like,
But it's
personally, if like UK got invaded, like that's a pretty big, you know.
Yeah, it's almost of a different quality because from my perspective, the North Atlantic community is almost like a single polity in a way that other areas of the world aren't. I'm sure you've heard this argument made about, the second 30 Years' War, where World War I and World War II are really, part of a civil war within the North Atlantic community. So to me, it strikes it as a little bit of a different quality than intervention, etc. But I think it's a difficult question that's probably impossible to disentangle from my own identity and the fact that like I had relatives killed in the Holocaust and that we're all sort of it's hard for me to disentangle. But
It's a,
I
yeah,
would
it's
say
a yeah, right. It's a loaded,
there's
yeah.
no
Like, would you? Yeah.
criterion, right? There's no like on this side of the line we don't fight Hitler, and on that side of the line we do fight Hitler. I don't think war making has that sort of simple criterion. This sort of systems approach won't work with it.
It
I'm
is it
just
is difficult then because it feels like we leave on the table the ability for good intervention. And of course, a war like World War II would never happen again. If it did, it would be over very, very quickly, you know. It seems like all real conflicts from this point forward are going to be nuclear powers bullying non-nuclear powers or non-nuclear powers having border disputes with non-nuclear powers. Like and that's it. Like that like it can't be anything more than that. Short of some kind of mass disarmament, it seems like that's the limit of what we can and can't do. If there was some kind of like oh, I don't know, like some kind of some warlord who starts from Sudan and just takes like further more and more territories. Like eventually they would get their hands on nukes as well. I'm pretty sure you can just buy those, depending on who's selling. So you couldn't even really do anything about that if they amassed enough power to be able. Yeah, I don't know.
I think like the way that I fall ultimately on these issues is that I think we have to work toward the creation of a genuinely democratic, genuinely international institution that we don't have yet, and I don't wouldn't even know how to build before we could actually basically get rid of the international anarchy I was talking about earlier, before we are able to make genuinely legitimate decisions about war. Otherwise, you wind up becoming like a Michael Walzer or Michael Ignatieff, where you like develop these arguments in favor of just war that wind up being the handmaiden of American military supremacy and empire, which is not the world that I want to build. I'm a humanist. I think we're all equally human, and we have to build institutions that reflect that philosophy. Ultimately, now there will be people like a Hitler who are anti-humanists, right? And so that runs up against that as well. And like, what if they don't abide by the humanist system, and what do you do then? And I think you ultimately have to go on democratic deliberation. That's what we've got, a genuinely democratic deliberation where various forms of inequality don't shape the discussion, which is utopian, but but this is what we should be building toward, I think.
I'm just going to
That's the
quickly
dream.
interject here and say that we're kind of approaching the hour and a half mark. Did you want to continue?
I was
for,
going to say final point actually.
Oh,
Yeah, I
okay,
feel
all
like
right.
we've resolved the well, perhaps not resolved, but at least arrived at and concluded and drawn through our major points and disagreements. Oh yeah, then I'll just conclude here then I guess. I don't know what metrics, if any, could be used to determine good interventionism versus bad interventionism. I feel like boots on the ground is a much higher bar than just providing military aid. In terms of the broader, like, American empire and the influence that it has and the alternatives to American empire, which, in my perspective, however it may be informed, would be Russian or Chinese empire presently. I guess the world that I envision, the one that is the most peaceful, that does not have a proletarian revolution in its recent past, tragically, would be one in which everyone is so bound by mutual trade obligations that nobody could ever benefit from a war. That everyone, like no matter what country you mess with, no matter who you bomb or who you depose, no matter what happens, you're going to end up fucking some element of your economy over because they were the ones who gave you your lumber or your cocoa beans or your natural gas or this, that, the other. And, ideally, you would just disincentivize it. It's all about incentive structures. America is always going to stand to benefit from engagement in imperialist action as long as we lose nothing from our behavior in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, wherever else, because they have nothing. They have dirt scraps and metal scraps that we dropped on them from drones. So, what's the harm of killing people there? None. They aren't relevant to our economic production at all. And if we could build the world up, in a way, this is the subtle peacekeeping of neocolonialism, because as horrible and as monstrous as it has been, if nothing else, the IMF and the World Bank's mission of making the world subservient to American business interests also means the countries which are made subservient are valuable to us in some way, valuable to us as slaves, I guess, in a analogous sense. And that means that there is some interest in ensuring that their infrastructural abilities are not destroyed, because that would hurt us. That's not the best outcome. I don't want the world to be kept peaceful because there's one master and 200 or so slaves. But I think that general trend, economic codependence, that's the idea. So I guess we can hope for that. I don't know. Maybe we just need to do for Russia what Japan did to America. Okay, we need to get them hooked on anime and Nintendo. Okay, we just get them hooked, and then we need Tetris remakes, and we can just mutual cultural exchange, and both governments are like, we both get 4 billion a year from this, whatever. That's the goal. Okay, we need a Russian Nintendo. They're making Stalker. No, that's in Ukraine. Shit, they made Pathologic. We need to fund the Pathologic 2 DLC. Get them in. There we go.
Let me just, I'll have this very, very final point. I think the problem is that these things are systems. So you won't ever be able to, be sure to prevent boots on the ground and only do one form of military aid or assistance. These things go together. And it's systemic. So you can't just block one or take out one. That's my understanding of how these work. Let me actually just close the window here. Sorry, guys. It'll be one sec.
I opened that. It was a debate tactic on my part.
With the blinding light that came in.
Yeah, to throw him off his game.
We did receive a very large amount of questions, and don't worry, Daniel, I'm going to give you a final chance. I'm just going to say to everyone who's been asking about a certain Coconut Island or a General Alden, unfortunately, I will not be fielding those questions at this time, but there was a surplus of them. I have one serious
debate, I swear to God.
But I will say there was a surplus of both, so yes, message received. Anyways, Daniel, you can get a final statement.
Oh, no, that was it. I'm done.
Oh, all right then. Okay, well, I will move on to the
best
questions.
Statement ever.
It's over. Goodbye.
All right, try to keep the responses, because I did get a lot of questions, so I'll just filter through to some of the best ones.
I'll be quick. I'll be expedient.
Quick, expedient answers to all of them. First one to Daniel. Where do you draw the line on what's acceptable for U.S. intervention or not? You like D-Day, right?
Oh, we just had this. We just had
True,
this.
but I thought maybe the D-Day part would be the one that you'd want to address. But if you want to skip that, because
I love D-Day. It's the greatest.
All right, to Vaush, why is Putin bad and Saudi Arabia good?
I don't think Saudi Arabia is good. I take great issue with our involvement in Saudi Arabia. By the way, if you want proof to my point, the reason why Saudi Arabia is butt buddies with us and isn't, say, for example, a smoking crater is because of OPEC, all right? We rely on them for our oil. If we didn't have economic codependence, and they rely on us too because we buy their oil, then we already would have found 16 reasons to bring democracy to Saudi Arabia. Okay, so, yeah. Oof.
Ask Danny what he thinks about the Budapest Treaty that has been signed in exchange for the disarmament of nukes in Ukraine.
Don't know enough about it, but any disarmament of nukes is generally good by my end. We have such an incredible amount of nuclear weapons on this planet. It's really striking that they've never really been used, except Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which was awful enough, but there haven't been large-scale nuclear exchanges. It's really amazing. I think we underappreciate how amazing that truly is.
Yeah.
We've been, what, like 5 minutes to midnight on the clock for a while now? Yeah. Vaush, how can you acknowledge the purpose that China has with their military base in Djibouti without recognizing the U.S. does it just to the tune of 700 times more?
No, no, I do. I'm just saying I think the only reason we're different is because we're more powerful and got a head start, you know? I think that given the same access to resources that we had, the time that we have, they will fill our space. If America stopped existing, they would do what we did, sometimes more cruelly, sometimes less, but the outcome ultimately would be comparable. Now, obviously, you know, he and I disagree on that, but I that's why I think it's important to always think of an opposition to imperialism not as an opposition to United States hegemony, but rather the logic of hegemony as a concept, to find ways to make hegemony impossible to affect no matter what, no matter who's pulling the levers, as opposed to just a mechanism of American disempowerment.
And I think that's how a lot of American policymakers think about it. And this is leading, I
Does
think I'm going to have
Vaush
to write
believe
on
that
this
his
and why
tendency
I
to leave
think
donations
that the
to the end of
metaphor of a
streams
vacuum
increases his
doesn't make
stress and
sense
hunger
when we're
levels and
talking about
further
international
complicates future
relations. I need to
streams?
really explicate that argument because I think it's based on a particular view of state interaction that doesn't necessarily might hold in the European context of the 17th century when the Treaty of Westphalia was first made, but I don't think necessarily holds on the international scale. So I thank you all for forcing me to finally write about this.
To Daniel, do you disagree the states have an inherent interest to expand their influence? He seems to be conflating human nature with the nature of states.
Well, this is the big question of IR realism. So, IR realism 101. There are three explanations for state behavior. They're usually called three images. Image one is human nature. Image two is the politics of states. And image three is the international system. So various sort of like whether you're a realist or you're a liberal or a constructivist, you'll answer those in different ways. But I essentially think in the actual miasma of history, those levels interact at various moments. And to understand a particular action, you've actually just really got to go into it. And it's hard to draw laws from it. This is why I'm not an international relations theorist. I think it's more useful to study history than it is to study theories of international relations in order to understand what's going on. So state,
Does Vaush think
the
weekly
second
UK buddy
image,
Vaush
sort of what a
segments
state
will
is
cause Russian
matters.
aggression to stop and Putin to
Human
play
nature is, I
roadblocks
think, too
instead?
malleable to be a useful category, but let's say persons matter, individual people. And then the structure of the international system also matters. And at various moments, one or more is less important, or
So,
more or less important.
so this one is interesting because it's a similar question for both of you, but it's worded differently. So for Vaush, do you want to and can we get rid of NATO?
Can we? Well, politically, I don't think there's the will to get rid of NATO, so probably not can we, like in immediate sense. In terms of should we, right now it seems like NATO only really exists as like the now you're safe from Russia blanket. You know, this is my assimilationist tendency. I suppose I would rather see Russia made a part of NATO than get rid of NATO. I feel like NATO is only relevant right now because of Russia. I feel like if Russia just played the game, NATO just would have been a completely vestigial budgetary drain that nobody would care about. But now NATO gets talked about all the time, always in relationship to border countries with Russia and what they want and who's afraid of who or what have you. The goal should, of course, be a peaceful region where every country is maximizing its autonomous political and economic potential. To the extent that NATO exists right now, I feel as though its presence increases benefit along those lines more so than it decreases it, if only because of Russia's behavior. But in an ideal world, there would be no need for a NATO.
And
Well,
before you answer, Daniel, the question that was worded to you is how do we get rid of NATO?
Good question. I wrote an article titled NATO Has Outlived Its Usefulness. So if anyone wants to go into details on that, they could just check it out. But basically that to me is an American political phenomenon. I think NATO essentially functions or doesn't function at the whim of the United States. And so if we want to get rid of NATO, we have to build a consensus in this country to get rid of NATO. How that's done, I don't know. Americans don't care about foreign policy for a diversity of reasons, mostly because they genuinely have no say in it. But barring that, I think NATO is just going to kind of continue as this vestigial thing, as Vaush kept on saying correctly, in my opinion.
Question for Vaush. Do you think the reparations that Germany was required to pay after World War I contributed to creating the circumstances for Hitler's rise to power?
Uh, fairly tangential. Probably, but I feel like the national humiliation element would have been present either way, and the material conditions which led to, Hitler's rise. The Great Depression would have happened anyway, of course. They still lost World War I and had the blame pinned on them, so that would have happened anyway. Maybe things wouldn't have gone quite how they went, but I feel like. I don't even know if the Treaty of Versailles was so much of an imperialism thing, so much as like all the dusty aristocrats of Europe wanting to like chuff and walk away from it and find a person to blame, and but yeah, I don't know. It probably didn't make things better.
I actually am a historian of Weimar Germany. My book discusses Weimar. I would say that that's correct. I would say recent revisionist historiography has actually questioned the material consequences of the reparations, but they seem to have been extraordinarily important in terms of the stab in the back myth, the Dolchstoß legenda, the psychological makeup of post-war Germany. It was really crucial for the rise of the Nazis and other far-right groups.
So this is a question for both of you, all in caps as well, and this is in relation to Ukraine. How do we not get dragged into this?
Well, I'll just say we are not bringing troops to Ukraine itself, so there are no U.S. or NATO troops that are going to exchange any fire with Russian troops unless they really miss the mark with some of their missiles, like by a couple hundred miles. So I wouldn't worry about that directly. I don't think, like, nobody wants nuclear war, which is a likely consequence of direct fire being exchanged between those groups. All we're really doing right now is making Lockheed Martin wealthy. So we're pumping weapons over to Ukraine. Some of them are going to get in the hands of far right, like supremacist groups in East Ukraine, and they're probably going to cause trouble or split off if Russia backs off or whatever. So I'm sure it's going to be an absolute shit show over there, but I doubt we're going to be directly dragged in.
Yeah, I think that's right. I would be shocked if there was serious U.S. involvement in the region. I think this is mostly a tendency of the American national security media to basically what's the right word, to over exaggerate threat inflation, which is something the American media loves to do, particularly the national security side of the American media.
Yeah. This is a question to Daniel. Why does your analysis of international affairs never include discussions of white supremacy?
It does. I would say the global order is based on white supremacy. I think the difference between the global north and the global south is ultimately based in white supremacy. I think different, how would I put it? Different, there's a reason Japan was bombed and not Germany, even though the war was won in Europe by that point. I don't think that's not an important reason. So yeah, I think colonialism is based on white supremacist notions, and it's baked into American imperialism. I'm sorry if I gave the impression that that wasn't a center of my analysis, because it absolutely is. And a fun fact for people, not fun, kind of depressing fact for people that might not know, do you know the journal Foreign Affairs? I believe the original title of it was actually Journal of Race Development. So I think these things really go together, sort of the notions of neocolonialism and American empire and white supremacy. And I would point people to the work of Robert Vitalis, whose book, I want to get the name right, White World Order and Black Power Politics, really goes through step by step how imperialist notions are white supremacist, oftentimes in origin.
And this one is the Vaush. Vaush, why you hate Russia so much?
I hate Russia. Well, I hate nation states in general. What are you? What are you, a liberal? Sheesh. No, the problem that I have with Russia is just that they're trying to occupy a role that they can't support, and the only reason they can get away with it is because they have so many nuclear weapons. That's it, really. There are plenty of other Eastern European countries, or like West Asian countries, the Stan region, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, blah blah blah, where these countries are generally politically reactionary, economically underdeveloped, and everything is gray concrete. Russia is in a similar position in many respects, but I don't hate those countries. Russia is just dangerous because in its efforts to maintain the relations that it held during the Cold War in a manner which it really can't do, It's causing problems, you know. It's agitative. It's certainly not as powerful as the United States, but the United States does its business in a much more measured way. In large part because, you know, we have the money and the global backing to get away with it. Whereas with Russia, it's like literally like putting troops on the border. Like, Jesus Christ, what is this? Like the early 20th century? Like this, it's passe. Okay, it's cliche. We're over it. I hate Russia because L plus ratio plus not early 20th century anymore. Plus you're corny. Plus get over it.
And I'll end on two meme questions. The first one is going to be for Daniel, and that is, what are your thoughts on Poseidism?
That is, I don't know much about it, to be honest. It's something to do with aliens, right?
Alien dolphin comrades are coming here to nuke us into the new revolution, and will usher in gay communism. Full luxury space gay communism through the process.
Oh, well, I haven't seen any signs of it yet. What a question to end on.
Finally, to Vaush. Does Vaush think weekly Okay Buddy Vaush segments will cause Russian aggression to stop and Putin to play Roblox instead?
Sake Tanuki.
Yep.
There's a reasonable chance of that happening. And if that is indeed the solution to peace, then peace is a long way away indeed.
Well, on that note, gentlemen, do you want to plug any of your respective websites, books, I don't know, GoFundMe's, Patreon?
Yeah, I'll end. If you guys could check out American Prestige, my podcast with Derek Davison. We have weekly episodes, weekly bonus episodes. We've got an episode with Rashid Khalidi coming out on Friday, and then we've got the first in our 10-part series on the history of Afghanistan. You know, before the war, before the American war, and through basically the withdrawal. And I think that's a really cool series and gives people a really deep understanding of what the history of Afghanistan and how it shaped the world.
I can't even count that high.
Then Vaush, do you want to sign off?
This is your chance, Lance.
Wait.
Sorry, it was my turn.
Do you want me to shamelessly plug as well?
No. That was me. I thought I had already done my thing. No, yeah, I'm Vaush, and you can find me at Vaush, or alternatively Vaush.com. .gg actually. No, I really appreciate the conversation. I had a good time, and I will take your points into consideration when next we talk, if we ever talk in the future. I will have a bulletproof Russian invasion plan. We'll really put the idea to the test.
You should look to this guy Napoleon. He did it really well.
Yeah, well, I'll study from history as you have to arrive at the most effective possible wintertime Russian incursion. And
then I guess if you want to see more or hear more of the person who contributed easily the most to this conversation, come check out theserfs.tv or youtube.com/the Serf Times or theserfs.tv there. It's where I reside. And thank you so much, both of you, for a very interesting and provocative conversation.
Thank you
so much for setting it up. Really appreciate it.
Y'all take care.
All right, we're back. Hey, well, that was interesting. That was not the fireworks I'm sure some of you wanted. You're probably all like, well, where was the blood, Lance? You promised us blood. Give me the blood, Eli. Give me the blood. Come on, Eli. Give me the blood. Yeah, I think I easily won that debate. I don't want to, humble brag too much, but as the person who contributed the most to that conversation, I think that was an easy victory from start to finish. Yep, that's all there is. But no, on a serious note, that was nice to see. I did see a really wholesome comment in the YouTube chat in amongst all the other super fighting that was going on. That was just like, it's interesting when you see debates between two people who might agree on a lot of things but have very distinct differences but still keep it civil. Is very nice to see. So there's that. You have to have a debate about without establishing heights. When did height become this big thing in the online worldosphere? Now it's just like, hey, by the way, are you 6'1", 6'2", or what, 5'7" and 3/4? If you got to say 3/4, clearly you're 5'7" or something like that. Maybe it wasn't enough drama for everybody. But we'll sacrifice some blood for the blood god at some point. There's that as well. Do you enjoy the Serfs but prefer not to have to use your eyeballs? Many are saying this. Well, we've got the solution for you. It's the Serf Times in podcast form, available on most major podcasting networks now. If you enjoy it, please consider leaving a good review and feedback because it really helps the show out, apparently, and it's free, just like the podcast.
To our gods, Xander Corvus and Peyton L. Just, we beseech thee to smite down our enemies. To our monarch, Tom Spiker, we are but your humble court jesters, here to amuse you. To our lords, Trevor R., we give thanks for this spit of land for us to eke out this meager existence. To our knights, Merid, Cheryl Alvarez, Ruby Kelly, Ellie Leslie, Alex P., Brandon, Words Greenwood, Nate, that one guy, Hagbird Celine, Matthew Scarborough, Stellar Vision, Ariane McCarthy, Daniel Sutton, Coulter Smith, Val 9000, Jenna Tall, Quiet 185, Anna Loves Riley, Omni, Riley and Anna, Poodlehawk, The Tim Caucus, Multi Mondi, Trevor Yanis, Lemmy 101, Anthropophojak, Cern 42, Catherine, Radical Maniac, Ramon Acosta, Nkosin, Violent Orchard, Sophie Baby, Political Puppy, Andreas Chiringuito, Zach Christensen, Josh Mickelson, Todd Buckingham, and Todd Lajeunesse. We raise our flag in a veil, and we salute you, our friends.